It was just another ordinary Tuesday morning when Dr. Rebecca Torres walked into her cluttered office at the Smithsonian Institute. Coffee in hand, she settled down at her desk, ready to tackle what seemed like the most boring part of her job. As a digital restoration specialist, Rebecca spent most of her days staring at old photographs, carefully bringing faded memories back to life. Today's task was no different, or so she thought. A wealthy collector from Boston had recently passed away, leaving behind his entire collection of vintage photographs to the museum. The donation included hundreds of images dating back to the 1800s. Rebecca's job was to catalog each one, check for damage, and decide which photos were worth preserving for future generations. She had been working on this collection for 3 weeks now, and honestly, she was getting tired of looking at the same types of pictures over and over again. Most of the photos were exactly what you would expect from that time period. Family portraits where everyone looked serious and stiff. Pictures of old buildings that no longer existed. Group shots of people in fancy clothes standing perfectly still because cameras back then needed long exposure times. Rebecca had seen thousands of similar images throughout her career. Nothing ever surprised her anymore. Or at least that's what she thought until she picked up photograph number 247. The image was mounted on thick cardboard, yellowed with age around the edges. Someone had written Millbrook Town Celebration, March 15, 1903, in faded blue ink on the back. Rebecca held it up to the light, checking for any obvious damage. The photograph seemed to be in remarkably good condition for something that was over 120 years old. She placed it on her scanner and began the digitization process, just like she had done with the previous 246 photographs. As the high-resolution scan appeared on her computer screen, Rebecca leaned back in her chair and took a sip of her coffee. The image showed about 30 people gathered in what looked like the town square. Men in dark suits and bowler hats stood next to women wearing long dresses and elaborate hats decorated with flowers. Children in their best clothes sat on the ground in front of the adults. Everyone was smiling, which was unusual for photographs from that era. It must have been quite a special celebration. Rebecca was about to move on to the next photograph when something caught her eye. In the background of the image, barely visible through a window of one of the buildings, there seemed to be something odd in the sky. She zoomed in on that section of the photograph, thinking it might just be a bird or perhaps a cloud formation. But as the image became clearer, her coffee cup nearly slipped from her hands. What she was looking at defied all logic. There, clearly visible in the sky above the 1903 town celebration, was what appeared to be an aircraft. But this wasn't just any aircraft. It had a sleek, metallic appearance, with swept-back wings that looked nothing like the primitive flying machines that would be invented years later. The object was leaving a distinct white trail behind it as it moved across the sky. Rebecca rubbed her eyes, thinking she must be seeing things. She had been working long hours lately, and maybe her tired mind was playing tricks on her. She looked at the screen again, but the strange object was still there. She zoomed in even further, adjusting the contrast and brightness to get a better look. The more she enhanced the image, the more impossible it became. The aircraft in the photograph looked remarkably similar to modern jet planes. It had a cylindrical body, wings that swept backward, and what appeared to be engine exhaust creating that white trail across the sky. But this was 1903. The Wright brothers wouldn't make their first successful flight until December of that same year, and even their primitive airplane looked nothing like what Rebecca was seeing on her screen. She checked the date on the photograph again. March 15, 1903. There was no doubt about it. She examined the handwriting, which appeared to be from the same time period as the photograph. The ink had faded in exactly the way you would expect from something written over a century ago. Everything about the photograph screamed authenticity, except for that impossible object in the sky. Rebecca's heart started beating faster as the implications of what she was seeing began to sink in. If this photograph was real and unaltered, it would completely change our understanding of history. But that seemed impossible. How could there be a jet aircraft in 1903 when the technology to build such a machine wouldn't exist for decades? She saved the digital file and immediately began examining the original photograph under a magnifying glass. She was looking for any signs that the image had been tampered with or manipulated. Double exposures were common in early photography, where two different images could accidentally be combined into one. But after careful examination, Rebecca couldn't find any evidence of tampering. The photograph appeared to be a single, continuous exposure. The lighting was consistent throughout the image. The grain pattern of the photographic paper was uniform. There were no obvious cut lines or paste marks that would indicate someone had added the aircraft to the image after it was developed. Everything about the photograph suggested it was genuine. Rebecca stood up from her desk and walked around her office, trying to process what she had discovered. She had worked with historical photographs for over 15 years, and she had never seen anything like this. She had examined thousands of images from the early 1900s, and none of them contained anything that shouldn't have existed at that time. She returned to her computer and began researching everything she could about Millbrook, Connecticut in 1903. She wanted to verify that the location and date were accurate. After an hour of searching through historical records, she confirmed that Millbrook was indeed a real town in Connecticut, and that March 15, 1903, fell on a Sunday, which would have been a typical day for community celebrations. Rebecca knew she needed to be absolutely certain about what she was seeing before she shared this discovery with anyone else. Her reputation as a respected expert in historical photography was at stake. If she was wrong about this, it could damage her career. But if she was right, this could be the discovery of a lifetime. She decided to examine the photograph one more time before calling in additional experts. As she stared at the image on her screen, she noticed something else that made her stomach drop. Looking more closely at the faces of the people in the photograph, she could see that several of them were looking up at the sky with expressions of wonder and confusion. They had clearly seen whatever was flying overhead, and their faces showed they were just as puzzled by it as Rebecca was now. This wasn't just a case of an unnoticed object accidentally captured in the background. The people in the photograph had witnessed this event, and their reactions were permanently frozen in time. Rebecca realized she wasn't just looking at an impossible photograph. She was looking at evidence of an impossible event that had actually happened over 120 years ago. Rebecca couldn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned, thinking about the photograph sitting locked in her office safe. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that impossible aircraft streaking across the 1903 sky. She had spent the rest of her workday going over the image again and again, hoping to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was a bird caught at an odd angle. Maybe it was some kind of early experimental balloon. But deep down, she knew what she was looking at defied every reasonable explanation. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at work an hour early. She needed to talk to someone about this discovery, but she had to be careful about who she approached. The scientific community could be harsh on people who made extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. She decided to start with someone she trusted completely. Dr. Antonio Rodriguez had been her mentor when she first started working at the Smithsonian 15 years ago. He was now one of the world's leading experts in forensic photography analysis, working with law enforcement agencies and historical institutions to determine the authenticity of questionable images. If anyone could help her figure out what she was dealing with, It was Antonio. Rebecca picked up her phone and dialed his number at MIT, where he now worked as a professor. After exchanging pleasantries, she got straight to the point. Antonio, I need your help with something unusual. I've got a photograph from 1903 that shows something that shouldn't exist. I know how that sounds, but I need someone with your expertise to take a look at it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Antonio had known Rebecca for years, and he knew she wasn't the type to make wild claims or waste his time with hoaxes. What kind of something are we talking about? He asked carefully. I'd rather not say over the phone. Can you come down to Washington this week? I think you need to see this in person. 2 days later, Antonio was sitting in Rebecca's office, staring at the same computer screen that had kept her awake for the past 48 hours. His initial reaction was exactly what Rebecca had expected. He leaned back in his chair, took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and put them back on. Rebecca, please tell me this is some kind of elaborate joke. I wish it was, she replied. I've been over this image with every tool we have here. I can't find any evidence of tampering. Antonio moved closer to the screen and began his own examination. As one of the most respected forensic photography experts in the world, he had developed techniques for detecting even the most sophisticated attempts at photo manipulation. He spent the next 3 hours going over every pixel of the image. The lighting is consistent throughout, he muttered to himself as he worked. The grain pattern is uniform. The perspective is correct. He paused and looked at Rebecca. Have you done any chemical analysis of the original photograph? That's what I was hoping you could help me with, Rebecca said. I need to know if this paper and the chemicals used in developing are genuinely from 1903. Antonio nodded and carefully examined the original photograph under a high-powered microscope. He took tiny samples from the edges of the image for chemical analysis. The paper composition, the silver content of the photographic emulsion, and the chemical processes used in development all needed to be tested. While they waited for the lab results, Antonio decided to bring in additional expertise. He called his colleague, Dr. Linda Kim, who specialized in historical photography techniques at the University of California. He also reached out to Professor David Blackwood, an aviation historian who had written extensively about early flight attempts. I want multiple experts looking at this before we draw any conclusions, Antonio explained to Rebecca. If this photograph is authentic, it's going to turn a lot of established history upside down. Dr. Kim arrived the following day and immediately began examining the photographic techniques used to create the image. She was particularly interested in the type of camera and lens that would have been used in 1903, the depth of field and focus. Characteristics are consistent with large format cameras from that era, she told Rebecca and Antonio. The exposure time appears to be relatively short, which was possible but not common in 1903. Whoever took this photograph knew what they were doing. She also examined the composition and framing of the image. The photographer positioned the camera to capture the entire crowd, but notice how the background window is perfectly framed to show the sky. It's almost as if they knew something important was going to appear up there. When Professor Blackwood arrived, he brought with him a wealth of knowledge about early aviation history. He spent hours studying the aircraft in the photograph, comparing it to every known flying machine from the early 1900s. This doesn't match anything that existed in 1903, he said definitively. The Wright brothers were still working on their first powered aircraft at this time, and it looked nothing like this. In fact, this aircraft resembles jet-powered planes that weren't developed until the 1940s. He pointed to specific features of the aircraft in the image. Look at these swept-back wings. That design wasn't even theoretically understood until the 1930s when German engineers began working on high-speed flight, And this white trail behind the aircraft? That's consistent with jet exhaust, but jet engines weren't invented until 1937. The lab results came back a week later, and they only deepened the mystery. The chemical composition of the photograph was exactly what you would expect from 1903. The paper contained wood pulp fibers that were commonly used in that era but later replaced by more refined materials. The silver halide crystals in the photographic emulsion matched samples from other verified 1903 photographs in the Smithsonian's collection. There's no doubt about it, Antonio announced to the group. This photograph was taken in 1903 using materials and techniques available at that time. There's no evidence of digital manipulation, double exposure, or any other form of fakery. Dr. Kim had been conducting her own research into the photographer and the event captured in the image. I've been looking into the town celebration itself, she said. March 15, 1903, was the annual Spring Festival in Millbrook, Connecticut. The local newspaper from that week mentions the celebration but doesn't say anything unusual about it. She showed them a copy of the newspaper she had found in the Connecticut State Library archives. But here's what's interesting. The newspaper from the following week has a small item buried on page 3. It says, "Several residents reported seeing an unusual flying object during last week's spring celebration." The nature of this object remains unknown. Rebecca felt her heart racing as she read the newspaper clipping. So other people saw it too. It wasn't just captured in the photograph by accident. Professor Blackwood was examining the faces of the people in the photograph more closely. "Look at their expressions," he said. "About half of the people in this image are looking up at the sky. Their faces show confusion and wonder. These people clearly witnessed something extraordinary." Antonio leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. As a scientist who had spent his career debunking fake photographs and exposing hoaxes, he was struggling to accept what the evidence was telling him. "We need to expand this investigation," he said finally. "We need more experts, more testing, and more research into what happened in Millbrook on that day. Because right now, we're looking at evidence of something that should have been impossible." The small group of experts sat in silence, each processing the implications of what they had discovered. They were scientists who dealt in facts and evidence, but the facts were pointing them toward a conclusion that challenged everything they thought they knew about history and technology. Rebecca looked around the room at the faces of some of the most respected experts in their fields, and she could see the same mixture of excitement and confusion that she had been feeling since that Tuesday morning when she first noticed something strange in photograph number 247. Antonio had made a mistake, and he knew it the moment he sent that email. After weeks of intense investigation, he had shared the details of the 1903 photograph with a small group of trusted colleagues, asking for their thoughts and theories. He thought he was being careful, only including 5 respected scientists in his message. But in the academic world, even the most incredible secrets have a way of spreading like wildfire. Within 48 hours, Rebecca's phone was ringing non-stop. News of the impossible photograph had somehow leaked beyond Antonio's small circle, and now scientists from around the world were demanding to see the evidence for themselves. The first call came from Dr. Jennifer Walsh at Oxford University, followed by Professor Chen Li from Beijing University of Technology, and then Dr. Roberto Morales from the Institute of Advanced Physics in Switzerland. "Rebecca, what have we gotten ourselves into?" Antonio asked during one of their late-night phone calls. He was calling from his hotel room in Cambridge, where he had been attending a conference that had quickly turned into an informal investigation of the mysterious photograph. "Half the physics department at MIT is arguing about temporal mechanics in the hallway," he continued. "People are taking sides without even seeing the original image. Some are calling it the discovery of the century, Others are calling it an elaborate hoax. Rebecca was feeling overwhelmed by the attention. She had always preferred working quietly in her lab, away from controversy and publicity. Now she found herself at the center of what was becoming the biggest scientific debate in decades. The first major theory came from Dr. Patricia Chun, a quantum physicist at Stanford University who specialized in theoretical time travel research. She flew to Washington specifically to examine the photograph and spent 3 days at the Smithsonian going over every detail. What if this isn't a hoax or a mistake? Dr. Chen asked during a meeting with Rebecca and the core investigation team. What if we're looking at evidence of an actual temporal anomaly? There are theoretical models in quantum physics that suggest time isn't as linear as we think it is. She pulled out her laptop and began showing them complex mathematical equations. In certain conditions, space-time could theoretically fold in on itself, creating what we call temporal loops or time slips. If such an event occurred in 1903, it might have briefly allowed an object from our time period to appear in the sky. Dr. Kim looked skeptical. You're suggesting that a modern aircraft somehow slipped back in time and appeared over Connecticut in 1903? I'm not suggesting anything definitive, Dr. Chun replied. I'm just saying that the mathematics don't rule it out entirely. And if we dismiss this possibility without investigation, we might be missing the most important scientific discovery in human history. Not everyone was convinced by the temporal theory. Dr. Jeffrey Harrison, a respected historian from Cambridge University, flew in with a completely different perspective. He had spent weeks researching secret government projects from the early 1900s, convinced that the answer lay in classified military experiments. There were more advanced technological projects happening in 1903 than most people realize, Dr. Harrison explained to the group. Nikola Tesla was conducting experiments with electricity and wireless transmission that were decades ahead of their time. The military was already interested in the potential of flying machines for warfare. He spread out a collection of documents on Rebecca's desk. I've found evidence of several secret projects that were being conducted around that time period. What if this aircraft was some kind of experimental prototype that was never documented in official records? Professor Blackwood shook his head. Jeffrey, I've studied every known attempt at powered flight from that era. There's simply no way anyone had the technology to build something like this in 1903. The metallurgy didn't exist. The engines didn't exist. The understanding of aerodynamics was too primitive. But what if it wasn't built by humans? Dr. Harrison asked quietly. The room fell silent. Nobody wanted to be the first to address the elephant in the room. But Dr. Harrison had finally said what several of them had been thinking. Dr. James Liu, a physicist from Caltech who had joined the investigation via video conference, was the first to respond. Are we seriously discussing the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation? Because that's an even more extraordinary claim than time travel. I'm not claiming anything, Dr. Harrison replied. I'm just saying we need to consider all possibilities. We have evidence of advanced technology appearing in 1903, decades before humans developed it. If it wasn't time travel and it wasn't secret human technology, then what other explanations are left? The debate continued for hours with experts, presenting increasingly complex theories. Some suggested the aircraft might have been a natural phenomenon that only appeared to be mechanical. Others proposed that the photograph itself might be from a different time period, despite all the evidence showing it was authentic to 1903. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a forensic expert from Tokyo University, had flown in specifically to conduct additional tests on the original photograph. She brought with her equipment that could analyze the image at the molecular level, looking for any traces of forgery that previous tests might have missed. I've examined over 10,000 historical photographs. "In my career," Dr. Tanaka announced after completing her analysis, "this image shows no signs of manipulation whatsoever. The silver particles in the emulsion are distributed exactly as they should be for a single exposure taken in 1903. If this is a fake, it's the most sophisticated forgery ever created." Meanwhile, Rebecca had been receiving calls from media outlets around the world. News of the mysterious photograph had somehow leaked to the press, and reporters were clamoring for interviews. She had declined them all, but the pressure was mounting. "The Today Show called again," Rebecca told Antonio during one of their weekly meetings. "So did CNN, BBC, and about a dozen science documentaries. They're offering significant money for exclusive access to the photograph." Antonio looked tired. The investigation had consumed his life for the past 2 months, and the constant debate was wearing on him. "Maybe we should consider going public," he said. "At least then we could control the narrative instead of letting rumors spread." But Dr. Kim disagreed. "If we go public now, we'll be forever labeled as the people who claim to find evidence of time travel or alien visitation. Our careers will be over regardless of what the truth turns out to be." The scientific community remained deeply divided. At conferences and universities around the world, the 1903 photograph had become a topic of heated discussion. Some departments banned any mention of it, calling it a distraction from serious research. Others organized special seminars to discuss the implications of the discovery. Dr. Alan Foster, a respected physicist from Harvard, published a paper arguing that the photograph represented a fundamental challenge to our understanding of causality and time. He called for a massive international research project to investigate similar anomalies. "We may be looking at evidence that our basic assumptions about the nature of time and space are wrong," he wrote. "If so, this single photograph could revolutionize physics in the same way that Einstein's theories revolutionized our understanding of relativity." But Dr. Margaret Stone, a historian from Yale, published a sharp rebuttal. "The scientific community is allowing itself to be seduced by sensationalism," she argued. "There must be a rational explanation for this photograph that doesn't require us to abandon centuries of established scientific knowledge." The controversy was tearing apart friendships and professional relationships. Scientists who had worked together for decades found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. Some were calling for the photograph to be subjected to even more intensive testing. Others were demanding that the entire investigation be shut down before it damaged the credibility of their respective institutions. Rebecca found herself caught in the middle of it all, wondering if she should have ever opened that safe. In her office, the simple act of cataloging an old photograph had somehow ignited a scientific war that showed no signs of ending. And despite months of investigation by some of the brightest minds in the world, they were no closer to understanding what had really happened in Millbrook, Connecticut on that spring day in 1903. 6 months had passed since Rebecca first discovered the impossible photograph, and the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. Despite having some of the world's best experts examine every pixel of the image, they were no closer to understanding what had really happened in Millbrook that day. The scientific community remained bitterly divided, and Rebecca was beginning to wonder if they would ever find answers. That's when Louise Walsh walked into her life. Louise was an elderly woman in her 70s who owned a small antique bookshop in Hartford, Connecticut. She had been following the news about the mysterious photograph in the local papers, though the mainstream media had been largely kept in the dark about the full details of the investigation. Something about the story had sparked her curiosity, particularly because her late grandfather had grown up in Millbrook around the turn of the century. "I hope you don't think I'm some crazy old lady," Louise said when she called Rebecca's office that Tuesday morning. "But I've been reading about your photograph from Millbrook, and I think I might have something that could help." Rebecca had received dozens of similar calls over the past few months. People claiming they had family stories about strange events or relatives who had seen unusual things in the sky. Most of these leads had turned out to be dead ends, but something about. Louise's voice made Rebecca pay attention. "What kind of something?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. "Well, when my grandfather passed away 15 years ago, I inherited boxes of his personal belongings. Most of it was just old papers and photographs, but there was this leather journal that he kept when he was a young man. I've been going through it lately, and there's an entry from March 1903 that mentions seeing something strange in the sky during a town celebration." Rebecca's heart started beating faster. "Mrs. Walsh, would you be willing to bring that journal here so we can take a look at it?" "Oh dear, I'm afraid I can't travel that far at my age," Louise replied. "But you're welcome to come here if you think it might be important." Rebecca didn't even hesitate. She canceled her afternoon meetings and drove the 2 hours to Hartford that same day. Louise's bookshop was exactly what Rebecca had imagined: cramped shelves filled with old books, the smell of aged paper and leather bindings, and dust. Motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Louise led her to a small back room behind the shop counter and pulled out an old wooden chest. "These are all of Grandfather's things," she said, carefully lifting out a worn leather journal bound with a faded ribbon. "His name was Thomas Hartwell," Louise explained as she untied the ribbon. "He worked as a shopkeeper in Millbrook his whole life. Never married, so when he died in 1954, my grandmother inherited all his belongings. She passed them down to my mother, who passed them to me." Rebecca's hands were trembling slightly as Louise opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to a brownish color, but the handwriting was still clearly legible. Louise flipped through several pages until she found what she was looking for. "Here it is," she said, pointing to an entry. Dated March 15, 1903. Rebecca leaned in to read the faded words, and what she saw made her gasp out loud. "Attended the spring celebration today in the town square. Weather was pleasant, and most of the town turned out for the festivities. Mrs. Henderson's children performed a recitation of poetry, and the Baptist choir sang hymns. But the most remarkable thing happened just before noon. A most peculiar silver bird appeared in the sky above us, moving faster than any creature God created. It left a white trail in its wake and made a sound like distant thunder. Many of us stopped our conversations to stare at it in wonder. Old Mr. Peterson claimed it was some kind of government experiment, but I have never seen anything like it. In all my days." The children were frightened, and several of the ladies gasped in amazement. The strange flying object was visible for perhaps 2 minutes before it disappeared beyond the hills to the east. "I cannot explain what we witnessed today, but I shall never forget the sight of that mysterious silver bird crossing our peaceful sky." Rebecca read the entry 3 times before she could fully process what she was seeing. Here was independent confirmation of the event captured in the photograph, written by someone who had actually been there, someone who had witnessed the impossible with his own eyes. "Mrs. Walsh," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you have any idea how important this journal might be?" Louise looked puzzled. "Well, I thought it might be related to your photograph somehow, but I didn't realize it was that significant." Rebecca explained about the investigation and the controversy surrounding the photograph. As she spoke, Louise's eyes grew wider with understanding. "You mean to tell me that Grandfather witnessed something that could change our understanding of history?" "If this journal is authentic, then yes, absolutely." Rebecca immediately called Antonio from the bookshop. "I need you to drop everything and drive to Hartford right now," she told him. "I think we just found our breakthrough." Antonio arrived 3 hours later with Dr. Kim, and both of them were amazed by what they read in Thomas Hartwell's journal. The entry perfectly described what they could see in the photograph, the town celebration, the timing, and most importantly, the strange aircraft in the sky. The details match exactly, Dr. Kim said after examining the journal entry. He mentions Mrs. Henderson's children performing poetry, and if you look carefully at the photograph, you can see a group of children standing together near the front of the crowd. They also noticed that Thomas Hartwell himself was visible in the photograph. Louise was able to identify him based on other family pictures she had, a tall, thin man in his 30s standing near the back of the group, his face clearly turned upward toward the sky with an expression of amazement. But they needed to verify that the journal was authentic before they could announce this discovery to the rest of the investigation team. Antonio arranged for the journal to be examined by forensic handwriting experts and paper dating specialists at the FBI crime lab in Washington. Dr. Patricia Myers, a handwriting expert with 30 years of experience, spent 2 days analyzing Thomas Hartwell's journal. She compared the March 15th entry with other entries from the same time period, looking for any signs that it might have been added later or altered in some way. The ink composition is consistent throughout the journal, she reported to Rebecca and Antonio. The paper shows uniform aging, and the handwriting style matches other entries from 1903. There's absolutely no evidence that this entry was added at a later date or modified in any way. The paper dating analysis confirmed that the journal was indeed from the early 1900s. The wood pulp fibers and chemical composition of the pages matched other documents from that era perfectly. Louise had also provided them with additional evidence of her grandfather's life in Millbrook. She had his birth certificate showing he was born in 1871, making him 32 years old in 1903. She had town records showing he owned a general store on Main Street from 1895 to 1943. Everything checked out perfectly. When Rebecca called the rest of the investigation team to tell them about the journal discovery, the reaction was immediate and intense. Dr. Chun flew in from California the next day. Professor Blackwood canceled his classes for a week to examine the new evidence. Even Dr. Liu, who had been skeptical from the beginning, admitted that the journal changed everything. "This isn't just photographic evidence anymore," Antonio told the assembled group during their emergency meeting. "We now have a written first-hand account from someone who was actually there, someone who saw the same impossible thing that was captured in the photograph." Dr. Kim was examining the journal entry with a magnifying glass. "Look at the specific details he provides," she said. "He mentions the sound it made, like distant thunder. He describes the white trail it left behind. He even notes that it disappeared beyond the hills to the east, which matches the direction the aircraft appears to be heading in the photograph." The discovery of Thomas Hartwell's journal sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Here was proof that the event in the photograph had actually happened, witnessed by multiple people and recorded by at least one eyewitness. It was no longer possible to dismiss the evidence as some kind of photographic anomaly or elaborate hoax. But the journal also raised new questions. If this event really happened, if people in 1903 really did see an advanced aircraft in their sky, then what did that mean for everything they thought they knew about history and technology? The answers they had been searching for seemed farther away than ever. Even as the evidence continued to mount that something truly extraordinary had occurred in Millbrook, Connecticut on that spring day over 120 years ago. 3 years have passed since that ordinary Tuesday morning when Rebecca first discovered something extraordinary hidden in photograph number 247. Today, she stands in front of a specially designed climate-controlled vault deep within the Smithsonian Institute, looking at the same image that changed her life forever. But now, instead of being alone in her cluttered office, she's surrounded by some of the most advanced scientific equipment in the world. The photograph sits behind bulletproof glass, protected by systems that monitor temperature, humidity, and even the amount of light exposure down to the millisecond. Security cameras watch it around the clock, and only a handful of people in the world have clearance to enter this vault. What started as a simple cataloging project has become one of the most heavily guarded mysteries in modern science. Rebecca often thinks about how different her life would be if she had just moved on to photograph number 248 that day. She could have been living a quiet, peaceful existence, restoring old family portraits and faded landscapes. Instead, she's become the reluctant guardian of what many people now call the most important historical artifact of the 21st century. The investigation team has grown far beyond the small group of experts who first gathered in her office. NASA has assigned a full-time research team to study the photograph. The Department of Defense has classified certain aspects of their investigation, though they won't say exactly what they've found. Universities from around the world send their best researchers to Washington, hoping to get a chance to examine the image that continues to defy explanation. Dr. Antonio Rodriguez, who started this journey as Rebecca's trusted mentor, now heads the International Committee on Temporal Anomalies, a research group that was created specifically to investigate the 1903 photograph and similar unexplained events. The committee includes physicists, historians, engineers, and even philosophers who are trying to understand what the discovery means for our understanding of reality itself. We've subjected this photograph to every test known to science, Antonio told Rebecca during their monthly review meeting. We've used electron microscopy, spectral analysis, quantum dating techniques, and computer modeling that didn't even exist when we started this investigation. Every single test confirms what we knew 3 years ago. This photograph is completely authentic. The evidence has become overwhelming. Independent laboratories in 12 different countries have examined samples from the original photograph. The paper, the chemicals, the silver particles, even microscopic traces of dust embedded in the emulsion. Everything points to 1903. There's no longer any serious scientific debate about whether the photograph is real. The only question that remains is how to explain what it shows. Thomas Hartwell's journal has been examined by experts from the Library of Congress, the British Museum, and the Vatican Archives. Handwriting analysts, paper specialists, and ink chemists have all confirmed its authenticity. But the journal has also led to other discoveries that have made the mystery even deeper. Louise Walsh, the elderly bookshop owner who first brought the journal to light, has become an unexpected celebrity in certain academic circles. She's helped researchers connect with other families who had relatives living in Millbrook in 1903. Through her efforts, they found 3 more first-hand accounts of the strange event. Mary Catherine Winters was 8 years old in 1903, and she wrote about the flying silver fish in a letter to her cousin in Boston. The letter was discovered in an attic in Salem, Massachusetts, when the cousin's great-granddaughter was cleaning out her deceased relative's belongings. Frank Morrison, who worked as the town's telegraph operator, mentioned the incident in his daily log book. He wrote that several residents came to his office asking if he could send messages to other towns to see if anyone else had seen the mysterious flying machine. The logbook was found in the basement of the old telegraph office, which is now a coffee shop. Perhaps most remarkably, they found a letter written by Reverend William Cooper, the pastor of Millbrook's Methodist Church. In a letter to his bishop, dated March 18, 1903, he struggled to explain what he had witnessed. "I fear you will think me mad," he wrote, "but I must tell you of the strange sight that appeared during our town celebration. A metallic bird of impossible design crossed our sky, leaving a trail of white clouds in its wake. Many of my parishioners were troubled by this apparition, asking if it might be a sign of the end times. I confess I have no explanation for what we saw. These additional accounts have been authenticated by the same rigorous process used to verify. Thomas Hartwell's journal. Each one describes the same impossible event from a slightly different perspective, creating a detailed picture of what happened that day in Millbrook. But the 1903 photograph is no longer unique. Over the past 3 years, Rebecca has received reports of similar anomalies from around the world. A photograph from rural France, dated 1897, shows what appears to be a disc-shaped object hovering over a wheat field. A daguerreotype from 1885, taken in New Mexico, contains an image of something that looks remarkably like a modern helicopter. A picture from rural Japan, dated 1901, shows a cylindrical object with no visible means of propulsion flying over a traditional village. We're not dealing with an isolated incident anymore, Dr. Patricia Chun explained during a recent conference. On temporal anomalies, we're seeing evidence of a pattern that spans decades and continents. Whatever happened in Millbrook wasn't unique. Each new discovery is subjected to the same intensive investigation that the original 1903 photograph received. Teams of experts examine every pixel, every chemical trace, every historical detail. And in every case, the evidence points to the same impossible conclusion. These photographs are authentic, and they show advanced technology appearing in times and places where it shouldn't have existed. The implications have forced scientists to reconsider some of their most basic assumptions about the nature of time and space. Dr. James Liu, who was initially skeptical of the temporal anomaly theory, now heads a research program at MIT that's developing new mathematical models to explain how such events might be possible. We're facing evidence that challenges our understanding of causality itself, Dr. Liu said in a recent lecture. Either our knowledge of physics is fundamentally incomplete, or we're dealing with phenomena that operate outside the rules we thought governed our universe. The discovery has also sparked new fields of research. Universities now offer courses in anomalous historical analysis. The government has established the Office of Temporal Investigations, though most of their work remains classified. Private research groups funded by tech billionaires are scanning historical archives around the world, looking for more evidence of impossible events. Rebecca still works in the same office where she made her discovery, though it's been expanded and equipped with state-of-the-art technology. Her job title has changed from Digital Restoration Specialist to Director of Anomalous Historical Research, and she now oversees a team of 12 researchers who investigate reports of similar phenomena. People ask me if I regret opening that safe, Rebecca said during a recent interview for a scientific journal. They want to know if I wish I had just cataloged that photograph as a normal historical image and moved on with my life. But how could I regret discovering something that has expanded our understanding of what's possible? She paused and looked toward the vault where the 1903 photograph remains under constant guard. We still don't have answers. We don't know what that aircraft was, where it came from, or how it appeared in 1903. But we've proven that extraordinary things can happen, even when they seem impossible. And maybe that's the most important discovery of all. The mystery of the 1903 photograph continues to challenge everything we think we know about history, technology, and the nature of reality itself. Scientists around the world are still searching for answers, but one thing has become clear: we live in a universe that's far stranger and more mysterious than we ever imagined, and somewhere in a climate-controlled vault in Washington, photograph number 247 continues to guard its secrets, waiting for the day when humanity might finally understand what really happened in Millbrook, Connecticut on that spring afternoon over 120 years ago.